And we're live. It is Monday, September 21st, 2020, 5:02 p.m. We are 2 minutes late today for no particular reason and for which we make no apologies. It is a beautiful day in Washington. My efforts, spurred by previous In Lieu of Fun guests, Carl Bergstrom and audience member Michael Fromberger, to make friends with local crows, were advanced significantly today. And I hope to have a progress report on the Crow Befriendment Project presently. It is a new year. Happy Jew Year, as they say.
That's
David Frum, that's something Jews can say and non-Jews cannot. David Frum is back from Rosh Hashanah in New York. And we are not allowed to have fun anymore because we are going to have a massive political crisis over the replacement of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But in lieu of fun, we can have David Frum. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you. And boy, do I love the title of this show, because it speaks to my profoundest personal philosophy, my profoundest child-raising philosophy. When the kids were little, they'd always say, "Dad hates fun." I say, "I do not. I do not hate fun.
I had you instead."
I love fun. And I just love the right kind of fun. And the two most fun things in the world are exercise and homework.
So I take it the kids did not find that a persuasive argument?
You know, they did not at the time, but I'm happy to say they did internalize it.
Well, there you go.
So the name In Lieu of Fun came from an audience member. Kate and I were... somebody DM'd me claiming credit for it, and I have who it was in my apologies to the father of the In Lieu of Fun name. But when we were first setting up the show, which we did entirely in tweets back and forth with one another, we said, hey, what should we call it? And like the first response in the replies was In Lieu of Fun, because it was, it was right at the beginning of lockdown. This is the 179th day in a row we have done In Lieu of Fun. Tomorrow will be 6 months. Wow. And, it's like we're not allowed to do the things that we like. We're not allowed to go over to your house and have a Never Trump party in your backyard anymore. There's all these things that we used to do that we're not allowed to do anymore. But we can get together at 5 o'clock every day and have a conversation with somebody interesting in lieu of fun. So I thought it was a pretty brilliant name. I don't know what the person who suggested it quite had in mind, but it does capture the moment as well as your general philosophy of exercise and homework.
I have not exercised very much in the last 6 months, so I just want to say that maybe it does. I've done a lot of homework though. I will say that.
So you're halfway there.
Yeah,
halfway to happiness.
So, David, I want to start with the question that I think everybody wants to know from you. You have written the books Trumpocracy and Trumpocalypse. And the key question is, will the third book in the trilogy be called Trumpademmerung?
The best suggestion I've had for a third title came from Clay Aitken. I did his podcast, and he suggested Trumpcarceration.
Whoops.
Trumpcarceration?
Trumpcarceration.
I mean, that is building on the theme of the antecedent in the word having nothing to do or rhyming with Trump at all.
I'm very much hoping that I'm done thinking about this wretched person. I think he will leave behind many structural problems in American life and law. But I actually, I'm not an optimistic person by temperament. but I think he is headed for an electoral beating. I also am very doubtful that he's going to get his way on the Supreme Court. So I think the world's going to look very different in about 60 days.
So Ben is currently having problems hearing us for
Oh,
I
dear.
don't know why, but I will just kind of like carry the ball for a second. I would love to hear more about what you think about the Supreme Court. So like, what do you think is going to happen? Like, we had someone come on yesterday that thought that possibly like as early as the 30th they could start confirmation hearings, to which I was like, I don't think that, like, just for very practical reasons, I think a lot of people will say for pandemic reasons and whatever else, we can't hold them that quickly. We need like a chance to get back to Washington. We need whatever. And like just the logistics of it wouldn't shake out. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on like the timeline.
Well, I think it's a more difficult project than people understand, and I think it may be a more difficult project than Mitch McConnell understands. So let's walk through it. So today, as you said, is Monday the 21st. Today was 1/13 of the number of scheduled Senate days between now and the election.
Oh, it's such a wonderful point. That's really useful.
So they've burned one out of their 13 days. They're not going to have a name until the middle of this week, probably the end of this week. That means they're going to burn about a third of their days before the election. So people say, okay, well, that's fine. They can do it in the lame duck session. Again, that gets a little harder than. So the election turnout models I see suggest there may be as many as 145 million votes cast in November, or in this election, up from 133 million last time. If you take the 538 aggregate of poll results, which put Biden at about 50.5 and Trump at about 42.5, and maybe that's not right, but that's where they average out. If you average them all out and you apply that to 145 million votes, that suggests that Donald Trump is going to lose the popular vote by 10 million votes. Mm-hmm. And a lot of Republicans in the Senate are going to lose their seats. Mm-hmm. Now, it's theoretically possible that in the face of that kind of massive 1980 in reverse style popular repudiation, that a president and a Senate try to ram through a nominee anyway. I mean, that's theoretically possible. But I think people flinch. And I think one of the people who might flinch is the nominee herself. Because presuming it's a woman, and you go through the list of it, and you say, okay, do you want to go through this project? I mean, why don't they have a name ready to go, given how little time there is? Why didn't they announce a name 9 a.m. this morning? Well, they haven't agreed on a candidate yet. And the uncertainty of the candidate may be one of the reasons, because imagine yourself as one of the people whose name has been mentioned. It may not work. And even if it does, you will be seen for the rest of your working career as someone who's benefited from a completely illegitimate act. These people are not monsters. They are sensitive to the opinion of the profession. Yeah. And there will be people like, and even if today, Lamar Alexander and Rob Portman say, I'm going to go along with this scheme. The morning after the election, when Trump is lost by 10 million, if that's right, and the Republicans have lost their majority in the Senate, that at that point they say, well, wait a moment, what we are really doing is inviting the Democrats to take massive revenge in the next session of Congress on a whole range, because if the rule is you can do anything you have the votes to do, you can do. Well, there are a lot of things the Democrats might want to do that they're going to have the votes to do probably starting in January.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I want Ben, just really quickly, I'm gonna drop this and then I'll like kind of leave it, which is just that like Kate Todd is like one of the names that has been dropped, and she's currently a counsel in the OLC, and I do not hear her being bandied about, but I have a few people in the White House that have like mentioned apropos of nothing how brilliant and smart she is. And so I'm kind of wondering if they're going to put someone like that forward rather than someone that's more expected and that they'd actually want. So I'm just kind of like posing that.
But if they do that, that doesn't make things easy. I mean, that person then may feel I have less to lose than an appellate court judge may feel. But that person is also going to say, well, wait a moment, how well vetted is this person? Do we know there aren't any scandals? The whole thing then looks even more like a conscious list crammed through. I mean, so if you pick somebody from the OLC, just, oh, they're smart, or the Trump people think they're smart. And the world's dumbest people think this person is smart. Even though she lacks any of the normal formal credentials. She's Trump's Harriet Miers.
Yes, that's almost exactly that's kind of what it seems like.
Okay, you're going to cram. So Bush couldn't get Harriet Miers on the court with after an election that he had fair and square won. So now you're going to have, in the face of this massive popular repudiation, you're going to, I don't know. I think people get, I think people get embarrassed, and the lack of time becomes such an overwhelming consideration. There's so little time before the election, and once the election is over, I think people will just flinch. Anyway, I don't predict this. I just say that the assumption that McConnell always gets his way may be about to run out of gas.
So I completely agree with you. I think everybody who's predicting one way or another where this is going to go with any confidence is blustering, frankly. I think there are a lot of moving parts, and actually my colleague Molly Reynolds and I have a piece coming out in your publication sort of analyzing the major variables and kind of concluding that it's very hard to predict at this point. The first variable is whether McConnell has the votes at all, right? And he can only lose 3. He's apparently lost both Collins and Murkowski already, although Collins is a little bit squirrely about it. It's hard for me to believe he gets Romney. And so my question as a preliminary matter is, and of course, McSally is likely to lose, so if you don't get it done before the astronaut, Kelly, takes office, which is a special election, so that happens almost immediately if he gets elected, is, you could end up without without the majority pretty quickly. But I think there are some interesting preliminary questions, like people like Cory Gardner, who's running significantly behind in Colorado. So if you're Cory Gardner and you're on the spot here, and he's going to have to answer this question over the course of the next few weeks, how do you game it out? You're running behind in a state that is increasingly purple or less red. You're not popular. The other guy is kind of popular. And you're trying to rehabilitate a campaign. Do you do that by towing the line, or do you do that by breaking ranks? So what's your Cory Gardner analysis here?
My analysis is if you're Martha McSally and you're truly a dead duck, then you keep faith with the party. Can you hear me? Do we have? Can you hear? Okay. If you're truly a dead duck, you go with the party. You think about your K Street career. You think about your future. The benefits from down the road. You no longer care about public opinion. But if you have not given up on your race, you have to say something independent-ish. And then the question is, do you intend to go back and live in your state? I mean, if Cory Gardner's future is on K Street or in Palm Beach, he can maybe do all kinds of conscienceless things. But if he wants to practice law in Denver, or have some future career in his own state, if you defy the idea of democratic legitimacy, that has personal consequences. And I think one of the lessons of the Trump years is that Donald Trump personally gets away with a lot of stuff that other people don't. But the people around him tend not to get away with those things. The laws of gravity have operated for them. If you commit crimes, you go to prison. If you make yourself unpopular, you lose elections. If you become a pariah in your hometown, it's something you have to worry about.
Sorry.
I think that we're both kind of standing there wondering who was going to ask the next question. But go ahead, Ben. Ben's muted.
Okay.
Ben, you're muted. Your whole question just got lost.
Well, this is like SCTV here. This is
It's like sometimes it works flawlessly, sometimes it doesn't. It kind of just depends on things. Not too long ago, I forget who it was, described the Never Trump movement as the remains of it can fit in David Frum's foyer. In the last 6 months, the Never Trump movement has had an incredible renaissance from the Republican voters against Trump to the Lincoln Project to the explosive growth of the Bulwark. And so my question is, what do you attribute the life, death, and life of the Never Trump movement to? It's had a weird trajectory.
Well, I've heard versions of that joke too, just as you have. And I do have fortunately, a pretty ample foyer, so there's room for everybody. But I think that joke has been obsolete since voting day of 2018, where what you saw was that the Democrats won the biggest congressional victory since Watergate on the strength of the biggest turnout since before the First World War. And they won that victory with votes from conservative-leaning people in suburban districts, especially conservative-leaning women in suburban districts. When George H.W. Bush's former congressional district, which has been Republican from 1966 to 2018, goes Democratic in 2018. When Eric Cantor's former congressional district goes Democratic, when Newt Gingrich's former congressional district goes Democratic, when Barbara Comstock's district, which was Republican for 60 of the past 66 years, when it goes Democratic, who's casting those votes? It's not AOC and the squad. It's people who own homes and have investment accounts and drive expensive cars. Those people send kids to private colleges. Those people, Republicans. And when Donald Trump loses, just today, Dan Crenshaw, who is a very intelligent man, he plays an unintelligent man on TV, but he is in fact a very intelligent man. He was doing some event back in his home district, and he talked about how everywhere he goes in Houston, he meets center-right people who have this irrational dislike of President Trump. So that's a kind of condescending thing to say about your voters, because the voters presumably know what they're doing. But the fact is, if you find in Houston that center-right voters in Houston overwhelmingly dislike President Trump, it's not a dinner party. It's not a dinner party. It's Houston. It's the Upper West Side of the Republican Party, and it hates the president. Dallas hates the president. San Diego hates the president. It's a mass movement, and in fact, I think we're going to discover that the pro-Trump. We're going to discover when this is all over that, by the way, very, very few people who acted pro-Trump. Well, you're going to discover all kinds of people. So, well, I thought the media was unfair. I was always trying to respect the process. But obviously, you'll understand. I never like.
I was afraid of Antifa.
Yeah, I'd have to Antifa and these unruly minorities who are coming to the upper income neighborhoods to steal pillowcases. We had to stand up to them. But yeah, no, it's going to be when this is all over. It's going to be. I keep saying, when this is all over, no one will admit to ever having been for it. Watch it. You just go through it. Sean Hannity won't have been for it.
Wait, did you say for him? Is that what you said?
Yeah, Sean Hannity, when this is over, will say, look, he was always for the policies. He understood that Trump, he didn't like the tweets.
Okay, well, I have 2 points on that. One is the ability for people to have complete amnesia as to who they supported at different points and the policies that they flat policy regimes that they outright supported or didn't support. Not to throw my parents under the bus, but let's just say that there was a group of people that used to think that they were for gay rights and they were not for gay rights, that there was a gradual change over time, and they look back and they're like, no, I never was that opposed. And then now there has been this gross change in social norms, and so they just kind of it goes through this change. I think that's the same thing with Trump. And I think it's the same thing. Honestly, we've talked about on this before with Clinton. And after the Clinton presidency, like the complete celebrity that he enjoyed, especially among Democrats, at least that I observed, that had like completely ignored the fact that he had done something, like they had this like affair with this woman, and that like tanked the Democratic Party in all of these different ways. And so I don't know. I really do wonder, like, when you say that people that support Trump now won't support him later, I wonder if that's true. And I also wonder, and this is kind of my second point, just really quickly, which is that, like, how much is this a class thing? Because you're right, in all of the cities in Houston and whatever, you might not see Trump supporters, but like in the outskirts, you see them all the time. Mm-hmm. And in the outskirts of like upstate New York, you see them all the time. And in the outskirts of like Boston, you see them all the time. In the outskirts of Washington, D.C., you see them everywhere. Right. And it feels like people who feel marginalized by society in a general way. And so that's kind of my upbringing and like how I kind of like, so I'm very curious how you think that. I don't think those people are going to feel bad about supporting Trump.
No, what they won't feel bad, but Trump's appeal, I can't claim this phrase, I quoted it, I'm not going to forget who I quoted it from, that Trump is someone who feels like a loser and acts like a winner. That he's always telling you what a winner he is because he feels like a loser on the inside. And I think a lot of people find that psychically appealing. And he's an icon of white cultural resentment. We've that as the country becomes more diverse, we have made white. We didn't used to have white people outside of the South. We had people, Catholics and Protestants and people from all kinds of ethnic backgrounds. We now have a generic whiteness because you tell people they are something, eventually they become that thing. And he's the avatar of their grievances and resentment. But remember how much of his appeal depended on being perceived as a winner. When he is perceived as a loser, if he is perceived as a loser, there may still be bitter enders. But I think a lot of the excitement that he had of just the fact that he gets away with this, that he drives the liberals crazy, and that's the idea that he gets liberal tears, that will look a lot less thrilling when should Trump go down by the kind of popular vote margin I think he's going to go down by.
So I totally agree with this, and I think the evidence for it is that even people, I think the group of people that you're talking about here, David, is not the people in my rural community near my cabin in the woods where Trump signs outnumber Biden signs 15-20-1. It's the political class, intellectual class, who are now shilling for I don't know about Sean Hannity, he may be a bitter ender, but the average Republican congressman who today can't bestir himself to lift a finger to criticize the indefensible, or who merely expresses concern at the most extreme things, they will discover that they never supported any of it, and they will try to rewrite history. And the evidence for that is the number of them that try to do it in real time. So, this propensity to be what Charlie Sykes calls anti-Trump, which is, insisting that you're not a supporter of the president. You're just more concerned about lawlessness in the streets, the excesses of the left, the radicalism of a backbench member of Congress like AOC, and you're afraid that those are the people who were secretly the puppet masters, along with George Soros, of course, behind Joe Biden, who's merely drooling in the corner. Like that type of person. That just sounds like
contrarian libertarianism to me.
No, but it's not always libertarianism. There are very respectable people who play this game, and all of these people.
Danielle Pletka's op-ed in the Washington Post 2 days ago.
Danielle's op-ed is the prototypical example. But with all due respect, half of Eli Lake's work falls into this category, right? I don't think he's ever copped to being a Trump supporter. In fact, he, I think, insists he's not. He just doesn't spend any time on that aspect. He spends all his time, on Pete Strzok or on the FBI effort to frame Michael Flynn, right? And so I think those people have already set up I was never part of this Trumpist world. I was just worried about the excesses of the other side argument.
Right. And then you can segue immediately so that the day after the inauguration or the day after the election even, you can say, okay, now on to the things I really care about.
Right.
And so let's have no accounting. But history is not going to allow it because or events are not going to allow it because there's no history of the capital H. But what's going to happen is, should Trump lose, he's going to find himself with a massive civil and criminal legal exposure. That it's not going to be possible for the society to move on. Or a lot of people, if the way the society moves on is a lot of people, not just at the federal level, but in New York, New Jersey, and Florida, a lot of people have to agree to create a network of Federalist pardons for Trump and his family and his business entities, because some of the tax and insurance and bank fraud will be committed by business entities, not by Trump personally. So you're going to need dozens, if not hundreds, of pardons from a number of different sovereigns if you want to never look into this. And so as it is, we're going to be dealing with legal aftershocks of Trumpism for a long time. And you're going to hear from people, and so a lot of the people who are say they're anti-Trump will in future be for pardons, not because they're pro-Trump, but we need to move on. And we will not be able to move on because we'll be discussing. There are so many areas of legal exposure. There'll be so many areas where the question of pardon will come up, and many of them will be civil areas where no pardon is possible.
So we have a related question from Catherine Maddox. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Hi, Ben. Hi, Kate.
Hey.
Have you missed me?
We have. I have. You're in a
We have indeed.
David Frum, I'm a huge fan of yours, despite all the things I disagree with you. But I have to say, I cannot tell you how many times I've laughed reading your pinned tweet. When this is all over, nobody will ever admit to having participated or supported it. It is hilarious because it encapsulates exactly the sort of revolutionary moment. It's just very funny.
Thank you.
Yeah, I tell it to my family members. I've tweeted it to them. Okay, quick question. So where do you stand on the debate about how to handle the enablers or Trump supporters? There is a sort of a debate in the conservative, excommunicate or bring them into the fold. And can I ask one more side question? I think Trump is going to win because I think the polls cannot measure chaos. And I think he's huge on Facebook, and I don't think pollsters get that metric. What do you think about that theory? Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much.
So I normally do stay away from that kind of punditry just because it's oversupplied, and I don't have the statistical expertise to deal with it. So I look at the poll turnout models. I look at the polls. I look at the averages of the polls. I don't see how he does it. And then if you look sort of state by state, I think he's going to lose Michigan, right? Because black turnout will return to more normal. He's probably going to lose Arizona, because that state has been extensively polled. At that point, there's nothing that can go right for him. There's no state, not Minnesota. There's no state where he was close, where he's got in 2016 that you can imagine him winning in 2020. And he can, minus Arizona, minus Michigan, he can just hold on. But at that point, literally nothing else can go wrong, and something always goes wrong. So I don't see it. But you may be right. It's not an area I claim to know a lot about. But as to what do you do about the enablers? There are different categories of of people. So there are the people we were talking about just a moment ago in upstate New York and rural Pennsylvania, the people with the Trump signs. And there are country people. They are, maybe deceived, maybe erring, maybe they've got prejudices of various kinds, but they're not going anywhere. And so the challenge for all of us is how do you rehabilitate them and reintegrate them into a democratic polity? And you can only do that in a spirit of forbearance and forgiveness. So of the people, if my turnout model is right and the projections are right, somewhere between around 63 million Americans will cast a ballot for Donald Trump. Probably something like 73 million will probably cast a ballot for Joe Biden. Can't treat 63 million people like pariahs, obviously, and you shouldn't. We have to reclaim them for, lowercase r republicanism. I think for the people Ben was talking about a moment ago, the cynical and like, what do you do with Ben Sass? I think you have to be as cynical about Ben Sass as Ben Sass is about Ben Sass, and take him at face value, and pretend to believe him. The question will be, what about those people who committed real crimes, and what about those people who are really integral to the project? And not just people who worked in the White House, but the lobbyists. And what do you do with the Matt Schlapps of this world? And what do you especially do with the family? And so I think I have zero appetite for protecting anybody from civil or criminal exposure. And I think the people who are crucial to the project, we just remember. And the next time it's proposed that they get any position of honor or commemoration in the United States under government or under private, you say something about it. That this is not and there's some optimism there. No major American corporation wants to hire Sean Spicer. White House communication guys, and women go on to amazing careers. Look at Joe Lockhart and Karen Hughes. There's so many examples. They go on to big careers. Sean Spicer did not, and
Dancing with the Stars, man.
That's what I just said, but I was muted. I was like, but he did Dancing with the fucking Stars, and
right, exactly.
It was like, come on,
right, and. So I think but I definitely think you need to find a way that your fellow citizens who got caught up in this, we have a larger project of democratic renewal in the United States, and we need to think very seriously about that. Not to treat them, you can treat them as a challenge. You can't treat them as an enemy.
Anglo-Quebecer Pauline Brock, the floor is yours. Let me unmute you.
Pauline, where are you from?
Montreal, living in Laval right now. And my mother was a huge fan of your mother. I really remember her very fondly. Now, the Canadian Conservative Party just anointed a new leader. What do you think is going to be their path? Do you see them sliding into the same kind of morass as the Republican Party, or there are some good things about conservative ideals, but that's just totally gone down the drain.
Yeah, well, I have to now like in Dr. Strangelove, hold down the hand here. Otherwise, we'll be talking Canadian politics for the next 40 minutes.
Oh my God! Could we please talk Canadian politics? That sounds lovely, and it's like marshmallows instead of getting hit in the head by like a 2x4 every 2 days.
But I think Canadian conservatives are what a center-right party in the modern world looks like, and not everybody. Not every will like it. Not everybody should. But let me make maybe a point about Canadian politics is maybe of more applicable in use to American politics. So Canada had a federal election in 2019, and the Canadian Conservatives under a man named Andrew Scheer actually won more votes than the Liberals under Justin Trudeau. They won fewer seats but more votes, and literally nobody thinks of this as any kind of problem for the Canadian system or for the legitimacy of the Trudeau government, including, by the way, no conservative would ever suggest that Trudeau was not a legitimate Prime Minister of Canada, even though his party got fewer votes than Andrew Scheer does. And in order to understand what's going on in the United States, it's useful to understand why that's so. Why is it that it wasn't a problem? And the answer is, in a parliamentary system, when you win by the rules, and the rules are always arbitrary, and it's very hard for any political system to map public opinion perfectly, what happens when you win is you get to be head of the government. And that's a job. It has certain powers and certain limits. But you don't, if Justin Trudeau were to go on national television and say, on behalf of the Canadian people, I say this, I think this is what the school should teach, people would think he had lost his marbles, that he is the head of government, and he has the job of running the government. And then the second most highly paid figure in the government is the person who sits across the parliament from him, the leader of the opposition, who also is not part of the government, part of the state. The leader of the opposition is also a state official. And the leader, and they both represent, and it's understood that both of you speak for part of the society, and you can never speak for all of it. And because electoral systems are always a little arbitrary, and because in multi-party system, it's always possible for the second and third party to gang up and form a coalition without the first party, it's always possible that the Prime Minister or Chancellor gets fewer votes. So long as that person understands the limits on their role and job. What is so dangerous about an anti-majoritarian U.S. president is the president, and especially this one, claims to speak for the nation and to treat those who voted against the president as outsiders to the nation, enemies of the nation. And that creates a special problem when the president is so massively repudiated at the polls as Donald Trump was in 2016 and as it looks like he's on the way to in 2020.
Toy tanks. Much in the chat, first time on the screen. It's good to actually see your face. Welcome.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
we can.
Okay, cool. So I was wondering what the DOJ's what do you call it? The anarchist jurisprudence determines that was released today.
Hold on. You're gonna have to say that one more time. I didn't hear it.
Yeah, we missed the beat.
Like flipped out for 1 second.
So I was wondering what you guys.
The DOJ's what?
Anarchist jurisdictions that was released. I feel like this is to what Trump was trying to sanctuary cities earlier in his presidency, and they basically turned around and said, "Hey, coercively, try to remove everybody's funding completely, or to the maximum extent of the law based on just one or two things here and there."
So we're getting terrible feedback on toy tanks here, but I think I picked up the question, which is your thoughts. He wants your thoughts on the anarchist jurisdiction designation that the Justice Department slapped on New York today, and specifically how it relates to the sanctuary cities war that the Justice Department has been fighting with a variety of jurisdictions.
Well, first, how can you put anarchist and jurisdiction in the same phrase? Isn't the whole point to... if they're anarchists, there's no jurisdiction. If there's jurisdiction, they're not anarchists. There's that. The thing that Trump is they're crooks. They are patriotically compromised. They're nasty people, but they're also morons. I mean, just like there's a part of this where you say, this is so childish. What do you think you are accomplishing? That days before an election, that you are just it's like childish name calling. And if you've got the idea that you're going to be able to somehow tear up federal funding formulas or apply other kinds of extrajudicial penalty, refuse to process nexus applications from the state of New York, and I think it amplifies. I think at this point we're pre-election, we're all involved in politics. That what Trump is setting up is a dynamic where 6 weeks from now, when the actual American majority gets its hands on power, that they've had the experience of being told you are not legitimate holders of it. Your 55% of the country are not legitimately American. Okay, well, two can play at that game, and the majority can play it more powerfully and effectively than the minority. So we are on the way. I mean, so what happens when the Biden Justice Department decides to pronounce, I don't know, Palm Beach, Florida, a racist jurisdiction?
And what happens when, when a significant, if very temporary, congressional majority on the part of Democrats imposes a whole lot of districting restrictions just as the new census data is coming in, and a whole bunch of state legislatures really tear up the rural base of Republican power, some of which would, by the way, be totally legitimate. And
I on these questions. I mean, as someone who is a lifelong, conservative on all these kinds of process questions, the Trump people have just convinced me of this. You guys have way too much power relative to your democratic rights, democratic standing, and you don't use it responsibly. You're dangerous. So just as a matter of public safety, I have to reduce. It's important to reduce your power to something like its real form. And so, and I find myself. One of the reasons I want this election this election can't come soon enough is I don't know where if this keeps going for another year on these process issues, I'm going to end up like some kind of maniac for proportional representation or something, because
you'll be standing on a street corner screaming about ranked choice voting.
Exactly. I with my wife, Danielle and I have been married a long time, and we both started very, very much on the conservative side of things. And I realized I'm married to a lady who shops at Zabar's. They're just like she's listening to like that's Upper West Side liberal. But so. I think that one of the things that's going to be important is we do need a lot of these process reforms, because the rural minority has behaved in a way that is selfish and dangerous to the stability of the country. You just don't do things like that. Talk that way about fellow Americans, however misguided you think they are. So,
all right. So an important process point. Yeah. So an important process point from In Lieu of Fun. Lisa Page is not allowed, because of a contractual obligation to an employment relationship, to appear on the show. But she does, we sometimes channel her thought in through the Lisa Page puppet, for which she has plausible deniability that this actually reflects her words. But the Lisa Page puppet has an important follow-up question about your reintegration point of 63 million voters.
Mm-hmm. You said earlier that you expect civil and criminal exposure for the family, but there is civil and criminal exposure. But if there is civil and criminal exposure, how can you bring the 63 million back into the fold? They will still feel all the same grievances.
I don't know. Okay, thank you, Puppet. That's very stylish and well articulated. So hypothetically, assuming, I wonder when the Trump people are no longer symbolic of larger issues in the society, I wonder how much anybody is going to care of the 63 million that. Donald Trump filed a claim for $15 million of hurricane damage on a property that had no hurricane damage, and that the state of Florida is now looking at that again. In a fact pattern, by the way, and while I think there is a statute of limitations on Florida on insurance fraud, the fact pattern in the case, it looks a lot like the insurance inspector was bribed. And I don't allege that would be maybe defamatory, but that's if you look at it, it looks a lot like that's a suspicious mind, an uncharitable mind might think that that's what happened. And there is
Trump, for example, might say everyone's saying.
Yes, exactly. So there are just hundreds of these cases, and I don't know how invested people are going to be in protecting Trump from a bank fraud case in New York, from an insurance fraud case in Florida, from federal tax fraud liabilities, and the other thing that is going to be, as the Lisa Page puppet knows better than probably anybody, that in these things the process is the punishment. So even if there's never actually a trial, I mean, just going through having to answer these questions is going to be punishment enough for the Trump family. And I don't know how much are people going to care once Trump's out of the picture. I mean, he's going to look pathetic. He's going to be tweeting and raving and ranting and calling into Fox and Friends, and they will this time hang up on him or maybe not take the call in the first place. And they're going to be onto they're giving us all kinds of signals about the other things they're going to want to talk about. And they're going to want to talk about Antifa and Biden's senility and making some backbench congressman the hate figure of the day. They're going to be, Fox needs there's a lot of continuity to the through line, but you always need to be taking characters. It's like General Hospital. You need to be taking characters on and off the stage.
Kate?
Yeah, I think to your point and to Lisa's point and to a lot of what we've discussed today, I think that my last question to you is just kind of going out of the Trump era. I wonder how much people will change. I remember growing, and I know I'm younger than everyone, blah, 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 but I do remember I never was particularly identified with a party, but I remember in my upstate New York town, in the outskirts of it, that people were incredibly pro-Bush. And this was in an era when I went off to college at Brown, and people were like, oh my God, the war criminal. How could anyone have ever voted for him? And I had grown up, my parents were Republican conservatives who had run on the Republican conservative ticket. And I kind of saw all of the differentials between locality voting and state voting and metropolitan voting, and how those all shifted so much. And I'm just kind of very curious to think that I don't know how much things are going to change after Trump. I think that there is going to be an amnesia that people have about him, the same way that there was an amnesia about Ford and Nixon and and the senility of Reagan maybe. I don't know, I just think that there's a lot to be said for the fact that that human memory is only so long, and that the news cycle is only so long, and so certain things kick up and certain things don't. And I'm just very curious to ask what you think that the long form is going to be after this, and in your worst case scenario, basically, what is your worst case scenario?
Man, I'm the wrong person to ask that question to, because my worst case scenarios are real dark.
We keep it pretty light on here, but I actually really wanted to know.
So Ashkenazi Jews are evolutionarily adapted for pessimism. Basically, the pessimists who said, I don't know, I think we should get out of here, they had grandchildren. The optimists, no, this will blow over, everything will be fine. They tend not to have grandchildren. So I am descended from a long line of people who said, let's just get out of here while we still can. What about the house? Don't worry about the house. We'll get a new house. Let's get out of here. Look, here's the worst case scenario is you get escalating low level white racialist terror as a political and extra political resistance to a government that is increasingly multi-ethnic, multiracial, and urban, and that the worst case scenario is that it's much of rural and exurban America is like in the 1870s, where you have guys with guns. The racial terror we saw in the Trump years, it wasn't always literally political. I mean, it's not clear, the guy who attacked the Gilroy Garlic Festival in California, not clear how exactly political he was. He had a mixture of motives. My worst case scenario is you just get a lot of that, a lot of people getting radicalized on the internet. The Australian murderer who attacked the mosque in Christchurch and killed more than 50 people, I think, he did a question and answer with himself. in his manifesto. And one of the questions he asked himself is, do you support and follow Donald Trump? And his answer was, as a political leader, good God, no. As a symbol of white racial resistance, yes. And that's the worst case scenario, is that Trump becomes a kind of John Brown's body moldering in its grave. He becomes, I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night of white racial terrorists.
Yeah, that is a good worst case scenario. I feel like, I'm sorry, I'm one of those people that needs to play out the worst case scenario so that I can then create some type of plan to counteract them at some point. So thank you. That was good for my anxiety, maybe not for anyone else's. Ben, I'm sorry, go ahead.
John Endersby, with the awesome drum background, the floor is yours.
I have a number of questions. Can you hear me, first of all?
Great.
We can hear you just fine.
Okay, the first one is, I'd like to start by saying I recall watching your mother on the Journal.
Thank you.
Many years ago. She's an excellent journalist.
Thank you.
In the early 80s, I seem to recall. Anyway, my first question is not really a question, it's more of a request for a shout out. And I think maybe you can explain this better than I can. There's 2 Canadian citizens being held in China currently on essentially false trumped-up charges, and the American president has indicated he would. I'll explain. Canada is attempting to extradite a Chinese national with a company called Huawei, and I just like Americans to understand the situation.
It's a complicated. Thank you. It's a complicated situation. I won't pretend I understand it as well as others. I may not understand as well as you. But what seems to have happened was the Canadians got in a position where they thought they were working with the United States against a Huawei executive who set foot in Canada, who was accused of various kinds of crimes. The Canadians arrested her. I believe it was a woman, and the Chinese got very angry and then retaliated against China. And at that point, the Canadians found themselves sort of alone in the room as Trump deserted them, even though they seem to have believed they had some kind of understanding with the Americans. Much of this is simply invisible to me, but I think it goes to something that's going to be an important theme of the next decade, which is when I worked in the Bush administration, now not quite 20 years ago, the American economy was about 7 times the size of the Chinese economy. At the time of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the American economy was about 3 times the size of the Chinese economy. Today, the American economy is maybe 35 to 50% bigger than the Chinese economy, and by the end of this decade, the two will be probably functionally equivalent. That we American policymakers have lived for a long time on the assumption that China is a country that the United States can unilaterally pressure. And the Trump people certainly seem to believe that China is a country they can unilaterally pressure. And those days are over. The United States can't, and certainly a country like Canada can't. And if we're going to impose any rules on the Chinese, it's more important, it's vital that the rule of law countries and democracies work together. And Trump has refused to do that. And so we're not individually strong enough. None of us, not even the United States, and certainly not the mid-sized countries. And we are barely strong enough if we act together to impose some rule of law on China.
I want to ask you about that, because I believe that with every fiber of my being, that that the only way to confront China meaningfully is multilateral action by the rule of law oriented countries. And yet I see the head of the State Department parading around saying we've got our swagger back. Pompeo says that at every opportunity, talking about the sort of successful actions that they've taken vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis a whole lot of other countries. Mike Pompeo is not a moron.
Right.
And yet he seems either to believe that we have had effective unilateral foreign policy for the last few years, or like that he's sort of delusional on the subject, or that he's just kind of lying. And so I'm interested in your sense of the psychology of that. Is this bluster? Is it self-delusion? Is it both? What's going on here?
Well, look, Michael Pompeo is a deeply unpleasant and dishonest and dishonorable human being. So that is some of what's going on. But I think there's something else, which is a generational thing. So, as I'm from Canada, I've always been very interested in British history and British imperial history. Think of the life story of someone like Anthony Eden, who was Prime Minister of Great Britain in the 1950s. So he was a young man. He fought in the First World War, where he had a very distinguished record. He emerges to find his country the great superpower of the world, the world's supreme. Britain in 1919 is at a unipolar. I mean, you can see there are some financial cracks, but they're rewriting the map of the Middle East. They are in control in Africa. They still have their Indian Empire, and so this person is in his middle 20s, I think, used to living in an absolute superpower. And then he becomes an aide to Churchill and fights the battle against appeasement, and is ready to be part of this eyeball to eyeball confrontation of the two greatest military powers on earth. And then he's prime minister he finally gets a chance to be prime minister himself in 1955, and he's running basically Belgium, and that the Egyptians see, India's gone, the Middle East is gone, the African Empire is on the way to going, and Nasser seizes the Suez Canal, and he, everyone can say it's you can't do anything about this. You don't have the clout. But he who remembers 1919 and 1939 and 1945, simply in 1956 cannot mentally adjust, and he's no moron either. But he cannot mentally adjust to how different the world of 1956 is from the world of 1945, never mind 1919. And that's Pompeo. I think it's too upsetting he's an unpleasant person. He's a bully. So a bully relies on power. And he needs the United States to be the country it was back in 1989. Of course, in 1989, we would never have tolerated a jerk like Pompeo anywhere near power. But I mean, that it's part of the American decadence that is hampering him is also the reason that he's able to be in the job that he's in. But he can't, and I think this is a challenge for many of us. I mean, one of the things that I think systematically biases modern politics is our politicians just live much longer than they used to do. And so you have people who are carrying around if this were the election of 1920 and the party of the president said, we're looking to 1868 as our model of how to win this election, people would think they were crazy. You're looking, it's 1920. There's like Picasso and jazz music and the airplane and the miniskirt and psychoanalysis. You can't learn anything from 1868. But in 2020, Donald Trump, who remembers says, I'm going to do the 1968 playbook, whether he understood it well or not. The idea that you would think that country still existed in 2020, that is just a mark of how difficult it is for people to keep their minds in the present when the politicians live into their 70s and 80s.
I am kind of fascinated by that comment, and I would love to have about another hour to unpack it. Oh, Ben, you should mute yourself. Sorry, just because when Ben is unmuted, we echo. Okay. But I think that there is, and I don't want to mute Ben, because if Ben wants to say something, Ben, do you have anything to say? You want to say about it?
I was just going to say, I think that's a really interesting point. The psychological inability to adjust. I think the comparison to Anthony Eden, who was not a highly unpleasant individual. Yeah. Mike Pompeo, it is conflated, or there's an interesting variable there, which is his unpleasantness versus and bombast versus this point that you make. But I suspect it is probably the dominant thing that's going on, is just this inability to adjust to a reality that's very different from the one that he expected to be in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we all, look, it happens to all of us, that we all, and one of the tests of advancing age, and, is can we accept that the country we live in is not the country we were born into? Can we adjust that? Can we learn from it? Can we listen enough to our own children and to other people's children to understand it used to be like this, it's now becoming like that, and if you're going to have useful solutions, you have to adapt to the country as it's going to be. That's something I wrote a long time ago in a different context, which is to be a patriot is to love your country as it is. And if you only love something that you think is gone, then, and if you love it, in fact, because it's gone, then you can't claim to be you're something else, but you're not someone who loves the country, because the thing you think you love doesn't exist anymore.
I love that philosophy, and I genuinely adhere to it. And I also think that it will be the end someday. What you basically what you ascribe will be the end someday of geographical boundaries in which people think of themselves as patriots. I think that there's going to be a time in which people are not constrained by boundaries. We had a couple of weeks ago on a Sunday and a mystery guest podcast, an advocate who was an immigration rights advocate for immigrants on the border of Mexico, and she was kind of speaking to the fact that it's crazy that humans have always migrated. They have always migrated. They have always moved places, and they've been forced to move places, or they have willingly migrated to places, and that the laws don't account for that, and don't let them in, or other types of things. And I think that there is something to be said for the fact that there's a, I don't know, a very large level of kind of change to happen in not just immigration reform, but in reform generally, about how people think about boundaries and how people think about what they are as patriots. I think that it's kind of, it's lovely. So thank you so much for coming on, David.
Thank you.
It was lovely to have you.
This is a lot of fun. Well, and I love this format. I didn't know quite what I was signing up for, but people actually not being able to just appear on the screen. That's a great happy hour.
Oh, this is all Ben. Ben found Crowdcast and made it happen, and it's so people can rapture in that are in our crowd. And it's it's so lovely. It's wonderful. It's really created a lovely community of people. But we have to wrap, and Ben hastens me to remind everyone that tomorrow we will be back. And wait, hold on. Wait, I can't do the math, Ben. 22 hours and 56 minutes from now, we will be back. 23 hours and 56 minutes, right, Ben? Right, Ben?
22 hours and 55 minutes from now.
All right.
And who will we be back with?
Sarah Longwell.
Oh, wonderful. Very cool.
And until then, we don't have fun anymore, but in the lieu of fun, we can have constructive conversations on the long-term benefits of polarization in politics. No, Ben, you're horrified. You're no one has those. I thought we just did. It was good.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, David. Thank you for coming.